Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig stood at the edge of a jungle clearing on Mindanao and watched the surrender happen in real time. Long columns of American and Filipino soldiers moving down a muddy road toward Japanese control. Tens of thousands were laying down their weapons. Around 78,000 men were being absorbed into prison camp reality. Fertig was 41, a mining engineer from Colorado who'd spent years in the Philippines building roads, bridges, and infrastructure for mining work. He wasn't a career combat commander, but he understood exactly what surrender was about to mean. The Japanese had come into Mindanao with overwhelming strength. Word had spread that General William Sharp had signed the surrender order for the island's remaining American forces. The instructions were blunt: report to the nearest garrison, comply, and hope for mercy. Refuse, and you'd be tracked down. Fertig didn't have to guess what awaited prisoners. News of the Bataan Death March had already filtered across the islands through rumor networks, refugees, and whispers carried from village to village. It wasn't a normal captivity story. It was forced marches, starvation, beatings, and killings for the smallest offense. A warning that the enemy wasn't looking to manage prisoners, but to break them. So Fertig watched the last column disappear into the distance and faced a choice that felt like two different kinds of death: walk into a camp and likely never return, or vanish into the interior and become prey. He turned away from the road and stepped into the jungle. Mindanao was the second largest island in the Philippines, about 36,000 square miles of mountains, rainforest, and swamp, bigger than Indiana. Japan held the ports, the airfields, the coastal cities, and the main roads. But the interior was something else entirely. Tribal communities scattered across volcanic highlands, Muslim Moro populations in the south with a long history of fighting outsiders, Christian Filipino farmers who despised the occupation, and, somewhere beyond the ridgelines, other Americans who had also refused to surrender. Fertig had none of the things a commander is supposed to have. No weapons, no radio, no money, no food stores, no soldiers. Only his engineering training, his familiarity with local communities from years of work, and a growing certainty that the usual rule book no longer mattered. On paper, it was hopeless. The Japanese had tens of thousands of troops on Mindanao, backed by aircraft, artillery, armor, and naval patrols that watched the coast. They also had a policy for guerrillas: capture, public punishment, and terror, meant to discourage anyone from helping. Patrols began combing the countryside for escapees. Rewards were offered for information. Villages suspected of hiding fugitives were punished. Families were threatened as examples. Fertig spent his first weeks sick with malaria, hiding wherever he could, at one point sheltered by an older American settler who had lived in the Philippines for decades. From concealment, Fertig watched the occupation's daily humiliations. Civilians struck for failing to bow quickly enough. Prisoners marched under guard. Whole communities learning that the new order ran on fear. And then an impossible thought took hold. What if the Americans scattered in the jungle weren't just fugitives? What if they could be organized? What if the Filipino resistance groups, dozens of independent bands, could be brought under one command? What if you could build an army inside enemy territory with almost nothing and keep it alive long enough to matter? It sounded insane. Fertig knew it sounded insane. He wasn't trained to lead a guerrilla war. He had no clear authority to command anyone. But he also understood something basic about the Philippines. Symbols of rank and legitimacy mattered. In a fragmented resistance, a leader without recognized authority would be ignored or killed by rivals. So Fertig did something that would either hold the movement together or destroy him. He found a local metal worker and had 2 stars made from silver taken from old coins. Then the mining engineer from Colorado promoted himself to brigadier general. In another context, it would have been absurd. On Mindanao in 1942, it was a calculated move. Not because Fertig believed in his own vanity, because he believed in what the symbol could unify. By the time he began presenting himself as the commander of American forces on Mindanao, He wasn't just defying Japan, he was defying chaos. If you want to see how a man with no supplies tried to turn a jungle into a military district, help this channel out. Leave a like and subscribe for more stories that don't get told often. Now, back to Fertig. His first problem wasn't fighting the Japanese. It was legitimacy. Mindanao's resistance was a patchwork. Former Philippine army soldiers, civilian volunteers, local strongmen, and outright bandits using war as cover. Many groups fought Japan and fought each other. Fertig needed an anchor, someone who understood the local terrain of loyalty and rivalry. That anchor came in the form of a Filipino constabulary captain named Luis Morgan, a mestizo officer with deep local credibility and a small armed following. Morgan had been resisting since the surrender and understood a painful truth. The guerrillas were divided by tribe, religion, and personal grudges. They might never unite under a Filipino commander from the wrong faction. But an American at the top, especially one who represented the promise of MacArthur's return, could become a common banner. Morgan agreed to serve as Fertig's executive officer. Fertig would be the symbol, the American general whose presence meant the U.S. hadn't abandoned Mindanao. Morgan would be the connective tissue, the man who could translate alliances into a working organization. Even then, Fertig was trying to stitch together not one island, but many worlds. In the north were English-speaking Christian communities, shaped by American schooling. In the south and west were Moro groups with centuries of resistance to outsiders and deep distrust of rivals. In the highlands were communities that had never fully been conquered by anyone. Each group had its own leadership, its own rules, its own reasons to doubt an outsider's promises. The Japanese exploited every fracture line. They recruited collaborators. They spread rumors that America was gone for good. They paid informants in rice and cash. For Fertig, every village could be an ally or a trap. But the deeper problem was even simpler. Fertig had no way to reach Australia. No way to prove to MacArthur's headquarters that he existed. No way to request weapons, medicine, or ammunition. Many guerrillas were fighting with old rifles, improvised shotguns, and bolo knives. Some units had almost no ammunition at all. If Fertig was going to build something real, he needed a radio. Specifically, a transmitter powerful enough to reach beyond the Japanese net and jump 2,000 miles across open water. That's when a Filipino engineer stepped forward. A man with mining company experience maintaining electrical equipment and enough radio knowledge to attempt the impossible. He believed he could build a transmitter from salvage. For weeks, he and his helpers scavenged components from wrecked vehicles, abandoned industrial sites, and ruined buildings. Copper wire stripped from dead engines. Vacuum tubes hidden by civilians before the Japanese could seize them. A small generator that could be coaxed into life with gasoline and brute effort. They built the station deep under triple canopy jungle, antenna lines strung between trees and disguised with vines. Everything was designed for flight. If patrols approached, the entire setup could be broken down, hidden, and carried out by porters in minutes. In early 1943, the transmitter came alive. The signal was unstable. The frequency drifted. There was no guarantee anyone was listening. Fertig sent one message anyway, one attempt to turn a private war into a recognized front. Then he waited, knowing silence could mean interception, failure, or a world that had already moved on without him. Weeks later, an answer crackled back through the static. MacArthur's headquarters had received a transmission from Mindanao, but they didn't trust it. The Japanese had run deceptive radio operations before, so the response came as interrogation. Personal questions only the real Fertig would know, family details, schooling, hometown facts. Fertig answered correctly. Even then, GHQ remained wary. A mining engineer claiming to command guerrillas. An officer who had elevated himself in rank. On paper, it looked like a trap. Or like a man unraveling in the jungle. MacArthur's message back was blunt. No self-made generals. Fertig would revert to colonel in official correspondence. If he wanted support, He would follow Australia's direction and prove the force was real. Fertig accepted the demotion in the paperwork. On the ground, he kept the stars. In Mindanao, the symbol still did the work he needed it to do. More important than the rank was what the reply represented. The Americans hadn't forgotten them. Help was possible. Not long after, a U.S. Navy submarine surfaced off Mindanao's coast with a single passenger. Commander Charles Parsons, a naval intelligence officer who knew the Philippines and spoke local languages. His mission was simple: evaluate Fertig, determine whether this general was legitimate, useful, or dangerous. What Parsons found stunned him. Fertig wasn't commanding a fantasy. He was building a system. Guerrilla bands were being pulled into a command structure. Officers were being taught discipline. Intelligence networks were forming inside Japanese-occupied towns. Coast watcher posts were appearing along shorelines to track ship movements. Reports were flowing. Everything was operating under the shadow of a Japanese military presence that could crush any fixed camp it could locate. Parsons returned to Australia with a clear recommendation. Fertig was not a delusion. He was exactly what MacArthur needed: an organized force behind enemy lines that could gather intelligence, guide rescues, sabotage infrastructure, and prepare the ground for the eventual return. After that, the sea lanes began to matter. Submarines started showing up with precious cargo: rifles, ammunition, medical supplies, radio gear. The loads weren't huge, only a few tons at a time, but for an army that had been scraping by on improvised weapons, even small shipments changed the balance. Fertig created distribution routes like an engineer designs a supply chain. Hidden beach landings at night, small boats into rivers, carts and porters through jungle trails, caches, handoffs, redundancy, always assuming a patrol could appear at any moment. The Japanese noticed the shift. Guerrilla actions became more frequent, more coordinated, less random. Ambushes began targeting specific objectives: bridges, convoys, communications lines. Someone was organizing the resistance. Japanese intelligence expanded patrols, tightened coastal security, and interrogated captives. Under torture and pressure, a name began to surface: Fertig. A price went on his head. The exact number faded into rumor, but it was said to be enough to tempt desperate people living under occupation. Fertig became one of the most hunted men on an island of millions, and his organization was still growing. He also understood a reality that pure firepower couldn't solve. Guns alone wouldn't hold Mindanao. Japan could always bring more troops, more artillery, more planes, but an occupation collapses when a population refuses to cooperate. So Fertig built more than combat units. He built a parallel civic order. Across guerrilla-influenced territory, a civil government took shape. Provincial officials, local administrators, courts to settle disputes, messengers and postal routes, clinics and improvised hospitals, schools that taught children outside of Japanese propaganda. And then came the most audacious piece: money. Guerrilla currency, crudely printed, stamped, sometimes handwritten on whatever paper could be found, circulated because Fertig's government backed it with a promise that liberation would make it good. He had no official authority to guarantee any of that. But belief is a kind of infrastructure too, and on Mindanao, people chose the promise of return over the certainty of occupation. Americans began filtering in as well. Servicemen who escaped the surrender, downed airmen, sailors washed ashore from wrecks. Each brought skills that mattered: infantry experience, radio operation, mechanical repair, organization. Fertig divided his forces into regional divisions and let commanders adapt to local conditions. In the north, Christian Filipino units hit convoys along coastal highways. In the south, Moro fighters used swamps and waterways to strike outposts and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Then Fertig went even further and did something that sounded like a myth until you remember what desperation can invent: a guerrilla navy. Small merchant vessels were armed with salvaged machine guns. Some mounted improvised cannons. One boat was reportedly armored with whatever metal could be found, including industrial scrap, turning civilian hulls into crude raiders that harassed Japanese coastal movement, intercepted barges, and forced the occupiers to treat every shoreline as contested. Meanwhile, the intelligence machine grew faster than the combat arm. Radios multiplied. Coast watchers tracked ships entering and leaving ports. Agents inside occupied cities counted troops, sketched defenses, and identified targets. This information didn't just make Fertig's war possible, it fed into the larger campaign. Submarines hunting Japanese shipping, and planners preparing the return to the Philippines depended on eyes and ears that could survive under occupation. Japan did not ignore the threat. Major offensives rolled into guerrilla areas, burning villages, punishing civilians, trying to crush the movement with a single overwhelming sweep. One of the first big pushes came in 1943, with multiple columns advancing into the mountains, airstrikes aimed at suspected camps, and coastal pressure intended to prevent supply landings. The plan was simple: converge, trap the guerrillas, annihilate them. Fertig had prepared for that scenario from the beginning. He refused to fight like a conventional army. When the columns advanced, his units dissolved. Camps emptied, radios and documents were buried or moved, staff dispersed to prearranged refuges. Fertig himself stayed in motion, never sleeping in the same place twice. Japanese troops pushed deeper, guided by maps that meant little in terrain that obeyed the jungle rather than roads. They found cold fire pits and abandoned caches. They found silence. Small patrols that strayed too far from the main body were ambushed. Disease tore through units operating in heat, rain, and unfamiliar ground. Supply lines stretched thin. Weeks passed, and the enemy they came to destroy remained out of reach. Eventually, the offensives collapsed into exhaustion and frustration. The Japanese withdrew back to garrisons in coastal cities, only for the guerrillas to reappear within days. Radios came back on the air. Distribution resumed. Civil offices reopened. The pattern repeated with later offensives. Dramatic initial gains, weeks of fruitless searching, rising losses to ambush and illness. Then withdrawal. And each time, Fertig's network returned more resilient than before. Japanese commanders slowly realized the shape of the problem. They weren't fighting an army in the conventional sense. They were fighting a population. Any farmer could be a spotter. Any village could hide supplies. Any trail could lead into an ambush. To truly control Mindanao would have required constant presence everywhere. Every town, every road, every household. An impossible demand on manpower, even for an occupying force with tens of thousands of troops. Fertig had started with nothing but an engineer's mindset and a refusal to walk into a prison camp. By turning legitimacy into a weapon, communication into a lifeline, and civil order into a shield, he transformed the interior into something Japan could raid, but could not truly own. Japan didn't have enough men to pacify Mindanao, and the brutality only made that problem worse. Villages were torched to punish suspected supporters. Civilians were executed as warnings. Prisoners were tortured for names. But each act of terror pushed more people toward the very movement the occupiers were trying to erase. Farmers who had tried to stay neutral crossed the line after watching neighbors murdered. Young men who had hidden from both sides stepped forward and asked for weapons. The occupation was manufacturing its own opposition. By the middle of 1944, Japanese intelligence was already circulating estimates that Fertig's command had grown past 30,000 armed guerrillas. The real figure was impossible to pin down because Fertig's system didn't fit neat categories. His organization blurred the boundary between civilian life and military resistance. A man might plant rice at dawn and carry ammunition along a jungle trail by afternoon. A fisherman could move supplies by boat under darkness, then sell his catch the next day in a market, watched by Japanese patrols. To the occupiers, it began to feel like the island itself had turned hostile. Headquarters in Manila drew a grim conclusion. Suppressing the Mindanao guerrillas would require forces larger than the garrison strength Japan had available across the Philippines. Those troops didn't exist, not with American forces pressing closer across the Pacific. Internal calculations warned that rear area security alone would swallow huge manpower, on the order of dozens of additional battalions just to guard roads, depots, and communications.
Every soldier assigned to protect supply lines was a soldier not facing the main invasion. Japanese staff summaries admitted the trap in their own words. They couldn't both fight the Americans and, at the same time, fully crush the guerrillas. Then the strategic situation snapped into a new phase.
In October 1944, American troops landed at Leyte, roughly 300 miles north of Mindanao. MacArthur was back. The liberation of the Philippines had begun, and Fertig's guerrillas were about to face their hardest and most decisive test. For years they had survived in semi-isolation, living off limited submarine deliveries and whatever they could capture or improvise. Now their war was no longer just survival. It became a forward arm of an advancing campaign.
Every ambush, every cut wire, every destroyed bridge directly shaped the battlefield for the approaching U.S. Army.
Submarine resupply shifted from occasional lifeline to urgent pipeline. Boats arrived with heavier loads and greater regularity. Crates of modern rifles replaced worn antiques and homemade weapons. Ammunition stocks finally allowed sustained operations instead of one-shot raids. Radios multiplied. Medical kits, explosives, spare parts, everything that turns scattered fighters into an engine flowed into the interior. New orders followed from MacArthur's headquarters. Intensify pressure on Japanese communications and movement. Cut telephone lines, drop bridges, ambush couriers, force the garrison on Mindanao into isolation, unable to coordinate with other islands, unable to request reinforcements, unable to report American movements with any reliability. The guerrillas answered with systematic sabotage instead of sporadic harassment. Teams targeted the backbone of command and control. Main telephone cables were severed, and when repair crews moved out, they were attacked. When Japanese units shifted to radio, guerrilla direction-finding teams hunted transmitters. Coordinates were passed on, and American aircraft struck. Stations that had carried orders across the island went silent under bombs within hours. Transport began to collapse under constant disruption. Bridges that had somehow survived years of improvised raids were now demolished with proper explosives. Roads were blocked with felled trees and disabled vehicles. Convoys that once traveled with minimal escort now needed heavy protection, and even that didn't guarantee safety. The operational tempo changed the map. A route that had once taken a Japanese battalion a couple of days to march between garrisons could stretch into weeks as ambushes, roadblocks, and detours accumulated. Meanwhile, intelligence to MacArthur's planners reached a level few Pacific operations ever enjoyed. Coast watchers tracked ship movements as they happened. Agents inside Davao counted troops, identified units, and sketched defenses. By the time American planners looked toward Mindanao, they were working with unusually detailed information. Japanese commanders were squeezed into a dilemma with no clean answer. American forces were moving through the archipelago. Leyte taken, Luzon under assault. Pressure building everywhere. Every soldier was needed where the Americans were landing. But pulling troops off Mindanao would expose garrisons to guerrilla strikes. Keeping troops on Mindanao meant fewer defenders at the decisive points of contact. The guerrillas had created strategic paralysis. In desperation, Japanese headquarters ordered yet another major push into the mountains, one last attempt to smash Fertig's strongholds and free troops for other fronts. Columns moved into the interior again in early 1945, expecting the same outcome they always desired, a decisive engagement, a trapped enemy, a final collapse. Instead, they met the same reality they had faced for years. Empty camps, vanishing opponents, ambushes on every trail, casualties mounting from an enemy who refused to stand still long enough to be crushed, and from disease in terrain that punished any force trying to occupy it. The offensive was still unfolding when American troops finally came ashore on Mindanao. Elements of the U.S. 24th Infantry Division landed on the western side of the island in April 1945 expecting weeks of brutal fighting against prepared defenses. What they found surprised them. In many places, beach defenses were already neutralized. Japanese forces that should have contested key approaches were dead, wounded, cut off, or pinned by guerrilla roadblocks. Moving inland, American units encountered uniformed Filipino troops who had been fighting for years. Men who knew every trail, every ford, every ridgeline. Intelligence specialists who could point to Japanese positions with unnerving precision. Veterans who had already paid the price of the campaign long before the first American landing craft arrived. The garrison that had once been counted in the tens of thousands was shattered into scattered pockets. The liberation of Mindanao became weeks instead of months. What had been planned as a grinding campaign against entrenched defenders turned into pursuit, hunting broken units already exhausted by years of guerrilla pressure. By early June 1945, organized resistance on Mindanao had largely collapsed, though small holdouts remained in remote areas. Post-war assessments credited Fertig's movement with killing thousands of Japanese soldiers during the occupation, wounding many more, and, most strategically, tying down manpower that Japan could not afford to spare. MacArthur summoned Fertig. The headquarters that had once questioned whether he was a trap or a delusional engineer now recognized what he had built. Fertig had accomplished something military schools rarely teach cleanly. He had created a disciplined force inside enemy territory, sustained it, and turned an occupied population into a functioning resistance system. Honors followed. The Distinguished Service Cross cited the persistence of his enterprise despite the price on his head and the constant proximity of the enemy. Other awards recognized the organization he forged and the effectiveness of the fighting force that confined Japanese control to fortified pockets. Philippine authorities honored him at the highest levels. On Mindanao, many treated him not merely as an officer, but as a symbol of liberation kept alive when liberation seemed impossible. But the recognition that mattered most came from the people inside the network. The guerrillas who had fought tanks and aircraft with homemade weapons. The Americans who refused surrender and endured years in the jungle. The coast watchers who risked execution to report ship movements. The radio operators who kept signals alive when capture meant death. They had built something unprecedented, a resistance that didn't just survive, but actively shaped a theater of war, and the implications reached beyond one island. Across the Philippines, guerrilla activity forced Japan to spend enormous effort on rear area security, troops guarding supply lines, hunting partisans, and policing towns instead of fighting at the front. Every unit pinned down by resistance was a unit missing from beach defenses. Japanese after-action thinking acknowledged the ugly math. Suppressing guerrillas required troops. Pulling troops from combat weakened defenses. Weakened defenses accelerated American advances. Faster advances left even less time to suppress guerrillas. It fed itself. American planners studied what happened on Mindanao closely. Fertig, an engineer without special forces training, had demonstrated that guerrilla warfare wasn't mainly about racking up enemy casualties. It was about building an organization. Legitimacy, discipline, logistics, intelligence, and popular support. It was about making an occupation unworkable through 1,000 small disruptions rather than one decisive showdown. Those lessons mattered as the world shifted into a new kind of conflict. After the war, Fertig returned to the United States, physically changed by years of malaria, deprivation, and constant movement, but mentally focused on what the future would demand. American military leadership recognized that upcoming struggles might require exactly what he had proven: the ability to organize resistance movements, train local forces, and fight unconventional wars against stronger enemies. Fertig was drawn into planning roles tied to special operations and psychological warfare. In the early 1950s, he served in Army headquarters work connected to those missions, helping shape institutions at Fort Bragg that would evolve into the modern U.S. Army Special Warfare pipeline. The world that later produced the Green Berets. He retired in the mid-1950s, returned to Colorado, and went back into mining. He avoided publicity. He didn't write a grand memoir. he let others tell the story. But in the Philippines, he wasn't forgotten. When he returned to Mindanao after the war, people lined streets to greet him. Some wept and sang, "God bless America," not because they romanticized war, but because he had given them something precious during occupation, proof that they hadn't been abandoned, and a promise that return and liberation were real. One historian would later rank him among the great guerrilla leaders of history. Whether or not you accept rankings, the core fact remains. An engineer from Colorado walked into the jungle with nothing and helped build a resistance that reshaped an island's fate. If this story hit you the way it hit us, support the channel. Tap like so more people see it. Subscribe for more forgotten chapters. And tell us where you're watching from. If someone in your family served in the Pacific, share that too. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories from disappearing.